Also, another thing that I really don't agree with here is another loophole in the USDA standard. Let's say you get corn oil or canola oil or sugar from GM corn. Because it's turned into a different product and that DNA is stripped out, they are legally not required to tell you that the high fructose corn syrup derived from the genetically modified corn is genetically modified high fructose corn syrup. They'll just label it as high fructose corn syrup.
Fair warning, you might not want to be eating while you listen to the broadcast tonight, or be prepared to spit it out. Eat at your own risk. Now, more so these days, it is becoming harder to find safe options to eat. And it's also more expensive to grow your own or to buy organically, stuff that may not have the GMOs. I mean, do you read the label on everything you buy? But despite the current regulations on the use of some of the products in what we eat, most of the chemicals introduced into our food supply over the past 20 years were not even approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Eat at your own risk. This is Into the Parabnormal. I'm Jeremy Scott. Our guest tonight, David Dubine, who has studied food cycles throughout history and how they affect production, the solar cycles as well. He is creator of the Adapt 2030 channel and Mini Ice Age Conversations podcast. He's joining us from the other side of the world where he's time traveled to Thursday. Good evening, David.
Thanks for having me back on. That was a great introduction to sum things up. And why is it important for everybody listening tonight? Well, as the food prices get more expensive, people are going to go for cheaper food alternatives and cheaper priced foods. The lower you go on the pricing, the more of that junk, chemical, and pesticide residues are in your food. So that's why it's important to talk about it tonight.
And that's why they've made the price of gardening so high, from the fertilizer to everything else.
Well, that's why you should know how to make your own fertilizers from things laying around, either your own yard if you're in a neighborhood or on a farm, or how to compost some of your foods to build soils. And that should be taught in our kindergartens on how to build soils to have gardens, but it's not. So that's the world we live in. They've gotten us reliant on systems entirely now, where what used to be partial reliant is now 100% reliant. And it took, since World War II to do that.
Yeah, and in your research, looking at everything that you have looked at over the years,
2024 in earnest is the year that everything has to have bioengineered food ingredients on it. But the sneakiness of the industry did a couple of things where they've changed the names from genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, which everybody understands. That's like the common one. We all get it. Well, they've moved that over to bioengineered foods or derived from bioengineering to confuse people. But that's not the thing. If it's one bioengineered product on the box, they will write it out. But if there's more than one bioengineered or GMO ingredient in that, the legislation allows them to put a QR code onto the box instead of actually writing what the GM products are.
This is the story of the worst road trip ever. In April of 1846, a man named James Fraser Reed, an Illinois businessman, eager to build a greater fortune in the rich land of California, leads 9 covered wagons out of Springfield, Illinois, on the 2,500-mile journey to California, in what would become one of the greatest tragedies in the history of westward migration. Reed found others seeking to find fortune, adventure, and new beginnings on this perilous trek across the West. Among them was the Donner family. Others like the Graves, Breens, Murphys, Eddies, McCutcheons, Kesebergs, and the Wolfingers would come too. The successful Reed was determined his family would not suffer on the long journey, as his wagon was an extravagant two-story with a built-in iron stove, spring-cushioned seats, and bunks for sleeping, and 2 hired servants to help with the workload. Reed's 12-year-old Virginia dubbed it the Pioneer Palace Car. Also in the group were the families of George and Jacob Donner. George Donner was a successful 62-year-old farmer who had migrated 5 times before settling in Springfield, Illinois, along with his brother Jacob. Obviously adventurous, the brothers decided to make one last trip to California. At the bottom of Jacob Donner's saddlebag was a copy of Lansford Hastings's Emigrant's Guide, with its tantalizing talk of a faster route to the Garden of the Earth. "It's tough, but the going's good," Tamsin Donner writes in her journal. "I could never have believed we could have traveled so far with so little difficulty. Indeed, if we do not experience anything worse, I shall say the trouble is all in getting started, but as leader of the wagon train, Tamsin's husband George Donner is aware there's one final obstacle to their journey, the Sierra Nevada, with peaks up to 14,000 feet. It's known if you fail to clear the mountain passes before the first snow falls, the repercussions and results can be both horrifying and deadly. As the Donner Party approaches Utah, George Donner makes a pivotal flaw in his decision to splinter off from the main party. Hastings Cutoff says it's a fine level road with plenty of water and grass, saving 400 miles. As it turns out, Donner's information is wrong. In fact, the so-called shortcut adds at least 100 miles to the journey. High in the Sierra Nevada, the Donner Party enters the Truckee Pass. They're only 30 miles from the California plains, but supplies are dangerously low, and traveling through the mountains is taking its toll, ending in a broken axle. The Donner Party stops to make repairs, but that night, 5 feet of snow falls. Soon the drifts are 60 feet deep. The Donner Party will be stranded for 5 months. In just 3 weeks, they've eaten all their food. Then they kill their pack animals. Next, they eat charred bones, twigs, bark, leaves, and dirt. Finally, a suggestion was made that were one to die, the rest might live. Cannibalism. On Christmas Day 1846, a Christmas feast like few others takes place. They devour their first human. Bodies are cut up, flesh labeled so people don't eat their own kin. Later, 4 rescue parties bring out some survivors. The very last finds a man named Ludwig alone. Around him, a scene that haunts us today and will continue to leave a lasting mark in history. Ludwig is surrounded by bones and entrails, a 2-gallon kettle filled to the brim with human blood. Also nearby is George Donner's body, his skull split open, his brain removed. Tamsin Donner's body is never found. It also seems a man named William Foster shot 2 Miwok Native American guides named Louis and Salvador for food, which is the only instance of anyone in the Donner-Reed party that was murdered and eaten. The rest of the cannibalized were already dead. They took the survivors to Sutter's Fort, California, by the route that is now known as Donner Pass. Stranded in the early snows of the Sierra Nevada mountains, nearly half the travelers died of starvation and illness. Even today, Interstate 80 has to be closed occasionally due to heavy snows and blizzards. Only 45 of the original 81 members of the Donner Party survived. This truly was the worst road trip ever, which reminds us not to be complacent but instead be proactive with our prepping. We don't have to worry about not having food to last. We have my Patriot supply. And right now, you can save $200 on a 3-month food kit with Adapt 2030. Adapt and stay prepared.
And now on with the video.
So then you have to take the time and get there's several of these where you can download QR codes to see what your food labeling is about. But let's say you're a busy father or mother, you're running, you got kids, next drop, next thing, it's homework, next class, next. Are you going to have the time to go in and scan every single box and look at that? Absolutely not. They're already counting on most people never having that QR code reader on their phone to even know what's in the food. And
Well,
it only applies to multiple layerings of GM ingredients.
And also that brings up the possibility that they could change the ingredients and then the QR code just goes to a different website or whatever the case happens to be. And it may not be the same ingredients from year after year or decade after decade. I know people who have said, this just doesn't taste like it used to back when I was a kid or back when I was in college or whatever the case happens to be, because ingredients do get changed over time.
We'll add one molecule or one atom on the end of it, and it changes the structure also. So what you talked about there is all these new chemicals that are coming out. They slam a hydrogen on the end of it, and it becomes an entirely new chemical that's not even designated yet through the EPA. This happens all the time with drugs and drug manufacturers. You know, all these, illegal highs that you can get in the petrol stations or gasoline stations, for those of you in the U.S., like a lot of times the DEA will start running through and flagging a lot of those and be like, all right, it's this chemical, it's banned. All they do is slam another atom on top of it somewhere. It's another hydrogen, it's another carbon, it's another whatever, potassium on there, and it changes that to a different chemical completely, and the classification of it is moved over to it can't be prosecuted legally because it's not the same chemical anymore. Literally, it's the chains coming off that are added one on the end, so it's not the same chemical. And this is what they continually do with either the farm chemicals, the pesticides, the herbicides, the fungicides. It takes them years to catch up with those movements. And then suddenly, oh, that's bad for us. What, like partially hydrogenated oils? We've all heard of, seen that in our foods, partially hydrogenated. Well, what it is, it's a liquid, and then they slam a hydrogen atom on the end of it, and then it turns it into a solid, which then can be mixed with foods to keep it stable. But see, this is the same thing for those of you who are understanding the oil industry. You know, the difference between your gasoline and your diesel fuel and natural gas is the length of the hydrocarbon chain that's in there. The longer the chains, the heavier it is. So the longest of the chains coming out of a barrel of oil is called bitumen, and that's what we call asphalt. But if you take those asphalt chains and you cut them into shorter chains, then they start to become liquids, like the liquid oils, like the oil that you would pump from supposedly dead dinosaurs. And then when you start stripping those chains and cutting them shorter, then they become those different chemicals themselves. And then the highest of them, obviously, are just going to be the gases of the base elements. But they're doing the exact same thing. They're taking an oil, a corn oil or a plant oil, adding an extra hydrogen to it and turn it into a solid. So they're basically creating bitumen, or the next step toward plastic, out of your food oils, out of your grain oils. It's insane what they have put in our foods. But again, it's all about what the cost of the food. When it gets too expensive to eat, you're going to start buying this junk. I know why it really needs to be discussed.
Because those companies, they have to make a buck too, and so they will resort to lesser quality additives and to put into their products so that they don't have to raise prices, or so that they can increase their prices, their profits rather.
Well, that would include the base grains too. Where does it come from? Does it come from a flooded area where water wicked up into the silo, and the top half of it was still good for delivery, but the bottom half was not even, it would have to be destroyed because it wouldn't even meet animal feed regulations? Just a quick 101 on this. There's a huge amount of grain stored up and down the Mississippi River in things called grain silos. Well, if there's major floods, and it could be a side tributary river, the water will get into the bottom of the silos, and the water starts to get sucked up by the corn or the wheat, because each one of those grains will get fully saturated, and then the next one above it will start to pull the water. And it goes up, and they call it wicking. So even if you have a 10-foot flood, you might have 30 feet of wick going up the silo there. And the top part will still be dry enough and good, but who's going to want to buy that? Nobody. They generally have to destroy the entire silo. But in this day and age, they'll buy that top half. And then you're already starting with the base problem, like what is the base ingredient used? These are the things we're dealing with now, with food prices becoming so high and those companies trying to save on cost. Labeled crops as genetically modified. Now, when you get that GM crop, you should be told that it's in your food, but the new bioengineering laws that were passed allow to put QR codes that'll hide it from view from your eyes. But also another thing that I really don't agree with here is another loophole in the USDA standard. Let's say you get corn oil or canola oil or sugar from GM corn. because it's turned into a different product and that DNA is stripped out, they are legally not required to tell you that the high fructose corn syrup derived from the genetically modified corn is genetically modified high fructose corn syrup. They'll just label it as high fructose corn syrup. And see, this is where the consumer gets caught in the middle here, is at the end product of what is made versus the beginning of it, they're trying to split the hair now. Well, it's not really GM because, the way we split that away from the DNA got ripped out of it. So in the product of the corn sugar itself, it doesn't actually have the DNA like the corn itself from the corn kernel with the germ and this sort of thing. They're really cutting a hair in half here. So beware of that as well. What starts as the original product is genetically modified doesn't have to be put on the label as a GM corn syrup because it's legally not, because of the DNA sequence ripping when they turn it into the corn syrup, and the germ and that sort of what you consider hard matter disappears out of that product and they turn it into the liquid sugar. The industry's run as far as it can to reduce price. They've done shrinkflation till they're blue in the face. We can't really go shrinkflation unless you open a box and it's only a quarter full any longer. Remember those old days, Jeremy, where you'd open a box and be 100% full, or a bag would be 90% full? Now it's like 25, 30, 40% full. The rest is
cereal,
gas or something.
Chips, the whole 9 yards. You used
everything.
to get what you paid for, but you don't anymore.
No, and then the cellulose, they've run the full gamut of cellulose. So I wanted to cover that when we come back in the next hour. Is the cellulose, they're legally allowed to put 28% of cellulose inside the food as fillers, but any more will have a human health condition with it when it goes over 30%. There's like thousands of peer-reviewed research. So they've run as high as they can on the cellulose filler to, save on product costs from the initial grain that they might need to buy. And then we got the green revolution with all the chemicals inside there. They can't really increase yields anymore. Even with the GM, we've run the maximum increase yield unless there's some sort of change in technology. And now we start looking at real effects on the ground of jet streams changing, wars affecting production, i.e. Ukraine. The industries are at the very wall of how they can save on cost before they're passing it on to you, before your food prices get really expensive. They've run everything. There's nothing left for them to try. And then now we have the natural factors of the jet streams changing, hydrological cycles changing on this 400-year cycle in the sun. And then we got this war cycle also where, we got disrupted shipping lanes, products are not available. And then we also have Ukraine and not going to be exporting, 20 million tons of grain are going to disappear off the market. But nature's throwing curveballs at us too with production all across every crop zone in the world right now. You add all these factors up, and then what's going to be left for most of the consumers? They're going to go for the bargain basement, cheapest junk they could possibly get because that's all they'll be able to afford.
You don't have any choice, and it's all about the quantity in which you consume. But we don't put warnings on these, pesticides or some of these chemicals, at least to the extent that really spells it out, that these literally are things that do not break down. They're around forever. You never get rid of them, and they have a long-lasting effect on the environment. And we're talking about, some of what is in our food supply, because you are what you eat. You were going to tell us about what's known as cellulose.
Let's all step back to COVID for a moment. Remember when they said, you're not a horse, don't eat ivermectin? Well, cellulose is basically plant fiber. You're not a termite, so don't eat cellulose, is basically the messaging I could broadcast now in this day and age. You're not a termite, stay away from cellulose. Cellulose is derived from the number one, the highest quality cellulose comes from bagasse, which is a product of sugarcane. So if you've ever seen sugarcane in your real life, in the middle is that very white, porous, spongy, fibrous. After they squeeze it, they break that down, they bleach it, they powderize it, and when it mixes with water, it's transparent. So the number one highest grade that you can get from that is from sugarcane bagasse cellulose. And then there's different ranges of it, and you can come down with sorghum. There's just an enormous amount of different cellulose types that are used. This is the whole thing that was being discussed, is what they can put in the food to make it look bigger. And when you said things just taste different, Well, if you go from Cheerios, which were 99% of your oats, and then you fill it with 30% of non-flavored bagasse cellulose, that then you have to make it flavored to make it taste like the rest of the product that it's mixed with. First, the texture will be different, but then secondly, the flavor will be different. And another thing that disturbs me is on food labeling, there's nowhere that it has to show you legally how much of that product is cellulose. If they're going to tell you that there's GM product in it, is it not fair that you should tell me how much of that product is made from wood pulp, basically?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to eat wood, then go ahead. If you want to eat bugs, to each his own, but at least tell us that we're eating wood and bugs.
That's not very good for marketing. You are fired as our marketing director. You should go hang out with the Bud Light crew, bro.
Yeah, it is all about the marketing. It's all about the money.
Because I am cleanly telling you right now what's happening with the farmer protest across Europe and the way the food prices are going to continue to rise with inflation, that a lot of people are going to get relegated down to eating this 3 meals a day, 7 days a week. Please, if you're hearing my voice, get seeds right now and learn how to start a garden. You will need fresh foods to supplement. So you have greens and other types of foods. You can grow your own sugar beets. You can learn how to process your own sugar beets into the sugar so you don't have to buy the sugars from the store that have been run through all these processes as well. You can raise bees and have your own honey. You can trade with other people. If you have extra vegetables, you can get some other cleaner product that you might need, like honey from somebody else. If you were to trade them XYZ fruit, there's an enormous amount of things to do to get off or break away 100% reliance on this system. But not a lot of people are implementing. But I bet when the price point gets high enough and there's enough pain, people will finally start to trigger or shift. Do you think they'll pivot away maybe?
Why are pesticides even used? Obviously, we know that they kill the insects, but you know, if you were to grow this stuff, say in your backyard or whatever, your stuff would probably turn out better than the stuff that's treated with the pesticides. So it comes down to the why.
It doesn't look so pretty. There's blemishes on the leaves. I mean, we have a garden every year. If I'm going into a store and I know that there's homegrown stuff in there, I'm looking for the blemished food, the one that looks perfectly polished, like it's out of a photograph of a magazine article. That's the type of thing that is, there's coatings on it. They're using some sort of wax coatings on the fruits, like let's use lemons or limes or apples or something. It doesn't look as pretty. It's kind of your short answer there. So do people want to buy pretty foods in the supermarket, or do they want to buy healthy foods that might have a few blemishes because the insects were really there because the insects thought it was healthy enough to eat it also?
As long as they're not genetically modified. The insects, that is, the bugs. I tried the crickets one time. I don't recommend the crickets. Just not any good, at least in my opinion. What I had. I'm sure there's some ways to make them a little bit more tasty, or to combine them with other foods to where you may not even notice them.
Yeah, I wanted to come back to the farmer protest for a second because this is not getting a lot of coverage in the United States. It is in Europe, obviously, because their food supplies are being disrupted right now. But in America, they're trying to not let the cat out of the bag. There's a couple of things happening in order of large to small. The farmers realize that they control the food and they can withhold it from the market, and then governments will change because angry citizens with higher food prices and lack of availability or ability to even, supermarkets are stripped bare in Europe in many, many places. So the farmers are withholding the food and deliveries the best they can into the supply chain, which is causing food to run out in regular neighborhoods. And then people are starting to complain to the government. So the farmers realize they have the power. The farmers have finally realized, coming together across all nations, if they all do the same momentum swing move and all prevent food from reaching the destination, and then also not selling the food, there's no legal obligation for them to sell food to anybody. So they're like, nope, we'll take a pass this time. You know, you're going to try to bankrupt our farms and confiscate the land anyway, so no, we're not going to sell to you. Because the large box retailers, the number one was Aldi, who would try to lowball the price and get them to bid in the same with dumped Ukrainian grain prices at 20% below market value. So let's say a farmer in Germany was trying to sell their grain into the co-op or into a buyer contract bid. They would just swing over and say, no, look, we can get this 20% cheaper from Ukraine. Take the price or leave it. And then the German farmers are like, well, we're going to lose 20% of what we thought would be revenue to keep our farms running. So the farmers have gotten the upper hand on the government over there to realize that unity moves agendas or backs them off and removes them. See, the whole thing was they were going to have to pay up to 100% increase for nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers because of CO2 taxes. The nitrogen fertilizers were going to cost double the price for the farmers this year. And next was when it really hit. Phosphorus also is another, you need that during flowering period. That was going to be another 100% tariff on that imported. So if the fertilizers came from Africa, if they came from Russia or whatever, it didn't matter where, they were going to be hit with a CO2 tax at 100%. And then there was a new law that was passed. So if you were to buy a tire now, you would have to pay for the disposal and a recycling fee now, not when you needed a new tire 10 or 12 years from now. You had to pay those fees upfront now. The farmer protests are not just about one single thing. They would frame it, the media would love to frame it as just one issue and that's it. The thing they're trying to hide, the largest elephant in the room is that all the farmers have come together and now are making the citizens change the government for them. But beyond that, there were 7 or 8 different new taxes and new tariffs and penalties. Another penalty was a new one that started this year. If you're a farmer, and let's use 5 acres as an easy number here, and you apply your nitrogen fertilizer to 5 acres of corn, they're using LIDAR and different layers in GIS mapping specific for runoff. And what they would do is if your nitrogen during rain had run off of your land, you were penalized. You were given a penalty because your fertilizer runoff had gone beyond your actual land ownership or demarcations of your property lines. That was another thing that was being added in. And it just never stopped. The amount of taxes, and the main goal was to take away the land to rewild it. And if anybody's seen that the new laws for rewilding have been passed in Europe, where they now are going to bring nature back to considered good condition. But a farm is considered a bad condition nature environment. So what they're going to do is, and this was the whole plan anyway, confiscate the farms and rewild them. But Jeremy, let me throw the most nefarious thing is, remember, we keep hearing from the World Economic Forum and that they wanted to take away and limit the world's food supply to cause starvation. But the way the thing is so nefarious in Europe is they pass so many laws and legislation and penalties, et cetera, that they have the farmers cutting off the food supply to the populace to enact regulatory change that the food supply is stopped. The same exact outcome was reached that the World Economic Forum wanted, but it wasn't the WEF on high making the food stop. It was the farmers who have now stopped the food supply. And think about the metrics on that. That was the plan, to get the food supply to start stopping around the world in different locations. But if the on high unelected bureaucrats did it, there would be, everybody on the street would be rioting, and the entire nation's populace would stand up at once and say no. But what they did is they passed so many regulations. They knew this would be the outcome, that the farmers would be pushed to the edge with no hope, back against the wall, and they would all do something in unison. But regardless, the food supply is being turned off at the spigot across Europe, the same exact objective that the World Economic Forum wanted, but the farmers are doing it. That's the insane thing when you wrap your head around this whole grain debacle and food price increases.
Or maybe they're just keeping the products for themselves, as they say, fend for yourself, and it's not getting out into the supply chain because, the farmers don't want to have to sell it commercially because of all these wild regulations, which is another impact that could have.
Yeah, and on the break, the news was talking about Ukrainian grain slowing down. So I have actually a slide I was going to use in a video later tonight, but I'll give it here first. So the Ukrainian grain exports in March decreased down to 270,000 tons from 641,000 tons. the same period last year. So if we're looking at Ukrainian grain exports out of Ukraine, that's a massive drop. Staggering amounts of grain that are not going to be there for developing nations, i.e. Africa and other more lesser developed economies rely on this grain from Ukraine. They call it deep water Black Sea ports. That's where 95% of the grain shipped from. Everybody with even a half open eye is out there seeing that that's not going to happen this year. And if you even consider that Ukraine is going to be able to plant this year and have a full agricultural season, when 700,000 men aren't there anymore, the entire, a huge amount of population is fled to get out of there to not get drafted. Where's the labor supply to even put the crops in the ground, or where's the supply chain? There's none. The roads are broken. All the irrigation's bombed out. It's going to go incredibly low. There might be something west of Kyiv, and otherwise we're looking at an extremely low grain supplies, which is then going to pull from somewhere else. So if you think these food prices are 8.8% from a year ago, are you kidding me? I will take that 8% and trade you my 50% any day of the week. These numbers are lies straight up that they're giving to the populace about how much food supply or percentages are rising up.
And what do you think about the studies that are saying that, we shouldn't grow our food in these small farms because that has more of a carbon footprint than, the stuff that's grown in big chunks?
That's nothing more than to try to get you back onto the supply chain that you've left because you're growing your own food. They're trying to get you back under control again. I mean, if you are making your own fertilizer, as part of that fertilizer process called composting is breaking something down that does release CO2. But I would ask you, as a small farmer and me, I have 25 acres in Tennessee, and we have a garden on like an acre of it, solidly an acre of garden. And then we have orchard and, we got chickens and geese and ducks and this sort of thing. But the 1 acre that's for the garden, the amount of compostable material I make myself and put on there is a fraction of just the CO2 output that would be one tractor trailer running the fertilizer out to be applied onto like a 10,000 acre farm. This is nothing more than hogwash to try to get people that were considering it, because you have to realize what's the border. How many people are on the borderline on the fence right now considering this year putting a garden in this spring? They may believe in the CO2, whatever the belief system is, but they know food's getting expensive. I might need to grow my own. And then these massive barrage of headlines, you're going to make more CO2 by you doing that. And then honey, I don't think we should put it out. We're going to create, because there's a lot of people that still really are deep into the Kool-Aid on that one. So think about how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people you could dissuade from starting a home garden this year just by running those headlines. How many people do you think it stopped from starting a home garden this year? Those headlines for those last couple of weeks.
Yep. Well, and if you tell people you're going to be responsible for more of a carbon footprint, and by the way, we're going to hit you with all these tariffs and taxes, you're back relying on that tainted supply chain.
Well, yeah, and start to live with the idea that you're going to need to barter in the future. Start thinking and kind of, move in that direction where the needle's swinging anyway. Think about being more self-sufficient and creating things that you could buy. Yeah, you could buy fertilizer, but can you create it yourself? Supply chains are getting sketchier by the minute. And if something really large kicks off in the Middle East, the oil and the energy is going to be greatly diminished. And then supply chains are going to get cut even further. And, if you think you're going to find farm tools just laying around over there at your local hardware store, they're going to be totally sold out. And if you think you're just going to go find your Scott's Turf Builder, whatever, or the XYZ little spray and apply fertilizers everywhere, they just won't be there. The mind frame is right now understanding where the world is going to and front running it. Because I always like Wayne Gretzky. Anybody out there, hockey players? He never said he skated to where the puck was. He always said he skated to the puck where it would be. And that's kind of the mind frame we need to be. Our minds and actions need to be out where we see the world moving to next year and 2 years from now. So we're already there when it comes to us. And we are already totally prepared when that set of conditions manifests, that we've already practiced and prepared for it. So when it hits, it's not a shock. It's our way of life already. And we just kind of meld right into that. As tough as it's going to be, I might say. Wherever you're looking, there's problems with food, and the elite know it, and they know that the populace is at the moment of all coming together to rise up against their darkness. So what would you do? Would you run for the hills or would you run for a bunker? Choice A or choice B?